My relatives laughed. "Oh look, the broke boys at the auction." I said nothing. 30 minutes later, I raised my paddle and bought the $8 million estate they came to bid on. The registration table sat beneath a white canopy tent on the circular driveway of Harrington House, and I could feel my cousin Derek's eyes on me before I even finished writing my name. I kept my head down, pen moving across the clipboard, pretending I hadn't heard his voice carry across the gravel. Well, would you look at that? Derek's laugh was performative, pitched loud enough to reach the small clusters of well-dressed bidders milling about the entrance. The broke boy actually showed up. I didn't turn around. Just slid the clipboard back to the registration attendant and accepted my paddle. Number 47. Marcus. My Aunt Patricia's voice was ice-wrapped in silk. She appeared at Derek's elbow, her silver jewelry catching the September sunlight. What a surprise. I didn't realize they let spectators in. They don't. I tucked the paddle under my arm. Good to see you too, Aunt Patricia. She looked me over the way you might examine a stain on expensive upholstery, something unpleasant that shouldn't be there. I was wearing a navy suit I'd owned for 3 years, nothing designer, nothing remarkable. My shoes were polished but showed wear at the heels if you looked closely. Patricia looked closely. Derek, darling, let's find our seats. She placed a manicured hand on her son's arm. The auction begins in 20 minutes. Derek grinned at me over his shoulder as they walked away, that same grin he'd worn at every family gathering since we were teenagers, the one that said he knew exactly where he stood in the world and where I stood beneath him. I found a seat in the back row of folding chairs arranged on the mansion's south lawn. The auctioneer's podium stood at the front, flanked by easels displaying photographs of the property. Harrington House, 12,000 square feet, 14 bedrooms, 6 acres of manicured grounds, a carriage house converted to a guest cottage, and a history stretching back to 1892. The starting bid was $4 million. My phone buzzed. A text from Ellen, "Everything okay?" "Fine," I wrote back. "They're exactly who I expected them to be. Remember why you're there." I pocketed the phone and watched as more bidders filtered onto the lawn. Most were strangers, developers, investors, the occasional old money family looking to expand their portfolio. But scattered among them were faces I knew. My Uncle Raymond, Patricia's husband, settling into a seat near the front with the confidence of a man who'd never been told no. My cousin Miranda, Derek's younger sister, scrolling through her phone with practiced boredom. And at the far end of the second row, partially obscured by a large man in a seersucker jacket, my own father. He hadn't seen me. Or if he had, he was pretending otherwise. That was his specialty, selective blindness, strategic ignorance. 23 years of it, to be precise. The auctioneer, a silver-haired man named Whitmore, stepped to the podium and tapped the microphone. The crowd settled. I kept my eyes forward and my paddle flat against my thigh. I should explain how I ended up in that folding chair, watching my estranged family prepare to bid on an estate none of them deserved. My name is Marcus Whitfield, and until 18 months ago, I was exactly what Derek called me, broke. Not destitute, not homeless, but the kind of broke that comes from growing up on the wrong side of a wealthy family. My mother, Catherine, was the youngest of 3 siblings, younger than Patricia by 8 years, younger than my father's brother Raymond by 12. She was also the only one who married poorly, at least by Whitfield standards. My father, Thomas, came from money too, but his branch of the family tree had been pruned by bad investments and worse judgment 2 generations back. By the time he met my mother at a charity gala in 1994, he was working as a mid-level accountant and living in a 1-bedroom apartment in Queens. The Whitfields tolerated him the way you tolerate a persistent cold, with sighs and tissues and the hope it would eventually go away. When I was born, my grandfather made it clear that any inheritance my mother might have expected would be held in trust until she came to her senses. She never did. She loved my father despite his modest salary and thrift store suits. She loved the small house we rented in Westchester, the used Honda she drove, the public school where I learned alongside kids whose parents worked in factories and restaurants. She died when I was 12. Ovarian cancer, caught too late. My father fell apart in the slow, quiet way that doesn't make headlines, stopped going to work, stopped paying bills, stopped looking at me like I reminded him of someone he loved. My grandfather swooped in with lawyers and custody paperwork, and suddenly I was living in the Whitfield estate in Connecticut, attending a private academy I'd never heard of, wearing clothes that cost more than our old monthly rent. I lasted 3 years. Not because I couldn't adapt, I adapted fine. I learned which fork to use, how to shake hands properly, which topics were acceptable at dinner and which would earn a cold silence. I learned to navigate my cousin's casual cruelty and my aunt's performative concern. What I couldn't learn was how to pretend I didn't see what they were doing to my father. Grandpa Harold had offered him a deal: sign away his parental rights, and the family would pay off his debts. Walk away, start over, pretend the last 15 years never happened. My father, still drowning in grief and now saddled with medical bills my mother's death had left behind, signed the papers. I found out 6 months later, when I overheard Patricia on the phone with Raymond. Complete severance, she'd said, laughing. Thomas didn't even negotiate. Harold gave him $50,000 and he vanished like smoke. I left the next morning. Packed a duffel bag, walked out the front door, and caught a bus to New York City. I was 15 years old. For the next 8 years, I worked. Washed dishes, stocked shelves, delivered packages. I earned my GED in a community center basement and my associate degree at a community college where I took night classes between shifts. I learned to code from library books and YouTube videos, learned to build websites, learned to think in systems and patterns and solutions. By 23, I was making $40,000 a year at a small tech startup in Brooklyn. By 25, I'd been promoted twice and was pulling in 75. That's when I met Ellen. She was a product manager at a competing company, sharp and ambitious and unimpressed by the carefully curated humility I'd constructed around myself. Our first conversation lasted 4 hours and covered everything from database architecture to our shared hatred of overhead fluorescent lighting. She asked me to dinner. I said yes. 3 years later, we were engaged, and she was pushing me to take a risk I'd been too scared to consider. "You have the skills," she said one night, sitting cross-legged on our apartment floor with takeout containers scattered between us. "You have the vision. What you don't have is the willingness to bet on yourself. Betting on myself means losing everything if I'm wrong. So you'll start over. You've done it before." She picked up a dumpling with her chopsticks. "The only difference is this time you won't be 15 and alone." She was right. She usually was. I quit my job and spent 6 months building the prototype for what would become Nexus, a platform that connected small businesses with enterprise-level supply chain management. It was nothing revolutionary, just a smart synthesis of existing technologies, packaged in a way that made sense for companies too big for spreadsheets but too small for SAP. I pitched it to 14 investors and got rejected 13 times. The 14th, a woman named Vivian Chen at a fund called Blackwood Ventures, saw something in the numbers. "You're not a unicorn," she told me at our first meeting. "You're a workhorse. That's rarer than you'd think." Blackwood invested $2 million. 18 months later, Nexus was processing transactions for over 3,000 businesses, generating revenue that made Vivian's partners very happy. When a much larger company came calling with an acquisition offer, she and I sat down to discuss our options. "They're offering $200 million, she said. "I know. Your share would be approximately $68 million after taxes and dilution." I knew that too. I'd run the numbers so many times the figures haunted my dreams. "What do you want to do?" Vivian asked. I thought about the bus ride from Connecticut to New York, the duffel bag that held everything I owned, the nights I'd slept in shelters because I couldn't afford a room. I thought about my mother's funeral, where my grandfather had spoken about legacy and responsibility while my father sat in the back row, already being erased from the family history. "I want to take the deal," I said. "And then I want to buy something." Harrington House had been in the Whitfield family for 4 generations. Not our branch, the main line, the one that had produced senators and captains of industry. But Harold Whitfield had married into that line when he wed my grandmother Eleanor in 1962, and through a series of deaths, divorces, and estate complications I still didn't fully understand, the property had landed in a trust controlled by the family as a whole. When the last direct Harrington heir died childless in 2019, the trust mandated a sale. The family had debated for years about what to do. Raymond wanted to buy it himself and convert it into a private club. Patricia insisted it should become a Whitfield retreat, a gathering place for future generations. Derek just wanted whatever made him look richest. They'd argued at Thanksgiving dinners and summer barbecues, hurled accusations about loyalty and entitlement, threatened lawsuits that never materialized. Finally, the trust administrators had enough. They scheduled an auction, open to qualified bidders, with a reserve price of $4 million. Any family member who wanted the property could bid for it fair and square. So could anyone else. I qualified. My banker at JP Morgan had made certain of that. The letter confirming my registration had arrived 3 weeks before the auction, addressed to Marcus Whitfield at my Brooklyn address. I'd read it twice, then tucked it into the folder where I kept important documents. "You're sure about this?" Ellen had asked when I told her the plan. "No," I admitted. "But I'm doing it anyway." She'd kissed me and told me she'd be waiting when I got back. Whitmore cleared his throat and began his preamble about the property's history and significance. I tuned out most of it, watching my family instead. Raymond was conferring with a man I didn't recognize, probably a financial advisor, there to manage the logistics of moving large sums of money. Patricia was fanning herself with the auction catalog, looking faintly bored. Derek had his phone out, undoubtedly texting someone about how tedious this all was. My father sat alone. He'd aged since I'd last seen him, at my grandfather's funeral 5 years earlier. His hair had gone fully gray, and there was a stoop to his shoulders that hadn't been there before. I wondered why he'd come. Surely he wasn't planning to bid. He had nothing, owned nothing, Existed on the margins of the family like a ghost that hadn't figured out it was dead. Maybe he just wanted to watch. To remind himself what he'd given up. "We'll begin the bidding at $4 million, Whitmore announced. "Do I hear $4 million? Raymond's paddle went up immediately. Patricia shot him a look of triumph, as if this opening bid was already a victory. $4 million, thank you. Do I hear $4,200,000? Another paddle, this one from a developer in the third row. Then Raymond again. Then Derek, apparently deciding his father was moving too slowly. The bidding climbed in increments of 200,000, then 300, then 500 as the competition thinned. At $6 million, only 3 bidders remained, Raymond, Derek, and the developer. Patricia was whispering urgently in her husband's ear, probably running calculations about how much they could afford. The developer looked calm, professional, utterly uninterested in family drama. $6.5 million. Raymond hesitated. Derek jumped in. 6.8. The developer countered with 7. $7 million, Whitmore said. Do I hear $7,200,000? Derek's paddle stayed down. Raymond's too. They exchanged glances, some wordless communication passing between them. Patricia's face was tight with frustration. $7 million going once. I still hadn't moved. My paddle was still flat against my leg, invisible to everyone who wasn't looking directly at me. Which meant invisible, period. No one in my family had looked at me since I sat down. $7 million going twice. The developer was already smiling, that satisfied expression of someone who's won a negotiation they expected to be harder. I raised my paddle. $7,200,000 from number 47, Whitmore said, his voice professionally neutral. Do I hear $7,500,000? For a moment, nothing happened. Then Derek turned in his seat, following Whitmore's gaze to the back row. His expression cycled through confusion, recognition, and something that looked almost like fear before settling on outrage. What the? Sir, please maintain decorum. Whitmore's attention had already shifted to the developer. $7,200,000 on the floor. Do I hear $7,500,000? The developer raised his paddle. 7.5. $7,500,000. Sir? He looked at me. $8 million. The words came out steady. I'd practiced saying them in my bathroom mirror, worried I'd choke or stammer or somehow betray how unreal this all felt. But my voice was calm. Clear. The voice of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. The developer shook his head slightly and set his paddle down. $8 million, Whitmore said. Do I hear $8 million too? Raymond was on his feet, his face crimson. Patricia was pulling at his arm, trying to get him to sit. Derek was still staring at me, his mouth open, looking for all the world like a man watching his house burn down. $8 million going once. My aunt's whisper carried despite her efforts to keep it quiet. We don't have that kind of liquidity, Raymond. Sit down. $8 million going twice. I met Derek's eyes. I didn't smile. Didn't gloat. Just looked at him the way he'd looked at me for 20 years, with the calm certainty of someone who knew exactly where they stood. Sold. To paddle number 47 for $8 million. The next 30 minutes were paperwork. I signed documents in a trailer behind the main house while my family presumably imploded somewhere out of sight. The trust administrator, a meticulous woman named Sandra, walked me through each page with the patience of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. You'll need to provide proof of funds within 72 hours, she said. Wire transfer preferred. My banker is standing by. She'll have it handled by tomorrow morning. Sandra nodded and handed me another form. The property transfer will be complete within 30 days, pending title search and standard inspections. You'll have full access beginning next week. I signed. Initialed. Signed again. When it was done, Sandra shook my hand with a grip firmer than I expected. Congratulations, Mr. Whitfield. Harrington House is yours. I stepped out of the trailer into the September afternoon. The lawn had mostly cleared, the other bidders had drifted away, the caterers were packing up the champagne that had been intended for whichever family member claimed victory. But near the main house's front steps, a cluster of figures remained. My Uncle Raymond spotted me first. He started walking before anyone could stop him, his stride purposeful, his face still carrying that dangerous flush. You conniving little, he stopped himself, visibly wrestling for control. How did you do this? Who backed you? There's no way you have $8 million. This is fraud. This is, Mr. Whitfield. Sandra had followed me out of the trailer. I can assure you that all bidders were pre-qualified. The sale is legitimate. Raymond ignored her. This house belongs to the family. You have no right. I have every right. My voice was still calm. I'd spent weeks preparing for this moment, gaming out every possible reaction, every accusation. I'm as much a Whitfield as you are. More, actually, since I didn't have to marry into it. The insult landed. I watched it register on Patricia's face as she approached, saw the flash of fury she tried to mask with her usual composure. Marcus. She made my name sound like something scraped off a shoe. Surely you understand how inappropriate this is. Harrington House has emotional significance to this family. It's not some trophy for you to wave around. You're right. It's not a trophy. I looked at the mansion behind them, at the weathered brick and tall windows and the century of history pressed into every stone. It's my home. Or it will be. Derek pushed past his mother. He was taller than me by several inches, broader in the shoulders, and he clearly thought that should matter. You're not keeping this place. We'll sue. We'll find a way to? To what? I met his glare without flinching. To prove I'm not entitled to something I bought legally, in an open auction, with my own money? Go ahead. I'll give you my lawyer's number. Your own money, he laughed, but there was no humor in it. Right. The broke kid from Queens somehow comes up with $8 million. Who'd you con? Who'd you steal from? I built a company. Sold it. Made a lot of money. I shrugged. It's not that complicated, Derek. Some of us actually work for a living. His fist came faster than I expected. I'd known he might swing, he'd always had a temper, always led with his anger when his words failed him, but I'd underestimated how quickly he could move. His knuckles clipped my jaw, sent me stumbling backward, drew a gasp from someone in the dispersing crowd. I caught myself against the trailer's exterior wall. Tasted copper. Felt the hot pulse of what would become a spectacular bruise. Derek. Patricia's shriek was genuine alarm. What are you doing? Raymond had already grabbed his son's arm, was pulling him back, hissing something about witnesses and lawsuits and being smarter than this. Derek was breathing hard, his hand shaking, looking at me like he wanted to finish what he'd started. I straightened up. Touched my jaw gingerly. And then I did something I hadn't planned, something that emerged from a place I didn't know I had. I laughed. It wasn't a triumphant laugh or a mocking one. It was genuine amusement, bubbling up from somewhere deep and unexpected. Because Derek had just assaulted me in front of at least 20 witnesses, including the estate's administrator and probably a lawyer or two. He'd handed me a weapon I hadn't even been looking for. Thank you, I said, still chuckling. Really? I couldn't have scripted that better. Derek went pale. Raymond's grip on his arm tightened. Patricia was already calculating, I could see it in her eyes, the liability, the exposure, the leverage I now held. This isn't over, Raymond said, but his voice had lost its certainty. We're going to contest this sale. You'll be hearing from our attorneys. I'll be looking forward to it. I nodded to Sandra, who was watching the scene with carefully neutral interest. I believe we're done here? We are, Mr. Whitfield. Congratulations again. I walked to my rental car without looking back. Got in. Turned the key. And drove away from Harrington House, my jaw throbbing and my hand steady on the wheel. Update 1, 3 weeks later. The lawsuit arrived exactly when I expected it, 2 days after the wire transfer cleared and 1 day before the title search was complete. Raymond's attorneys had filed in Connecticut State Court, claiming the auction had been conducted improperly and demanding it be voided. Their argument was creative, I'll give them that. They claimed the trust administrators had failed to provide adequate notice to all beneficiaries, that I'd somehow obtained confidential information about family finances to time my bid strategically, and that my relationship to the family created a conflict of interest that should have disqualified me from participating. None of it would hold up. My lawyer, a pragmatic woman named Janet who specialized in real estate litigation, had already torn their filing apart. They're stalling, she said over the phone. They know they can't win. They're hoping you'll get tired of paying legal fees and offer to settle. How long can they drag this out? 6 months minimum. A year if they're really determined. But every delay costs them too, and from what you've told me about their financial situation, they can't afford a prolonged fight. She was right about that. I'd done my research. Raymond's investment firm had been struggling since 2020, hemorrhaging clients who'd lost faith in his judgment after a series of questionable bets. Patricia's personal accounts were leveraged against their primary residence, a house in Greenwich that was mortgaged to its limits. Derek had never held a job longer than 18 months and was entirely dependent on his parents' dwindling generosity. They were bleeding money, and suing me would only accelerate the bleed. Let them file, I told Janet. Respond appropriately but don't engage more than necessary. I want this to cost them. That's cold. It's strategic. She laughed. Same thing sometimes. I'll keep you posted. The next call I made was harder. I'd been putting it off for days, finding excuses, too busy, too tired, not the right moment. But Ellen had finally cornered me that morning, sitting across the breakfast table with her coffee untouched. You have to talk to him eventually. I know. The longer you wait, the harder it gets. I know that too. She'd reached across the table and squeezed my hand. He's your father, Marcus. Whatever he did, whatever happened, he's still that. And he was there. At the auction. He saw you win. So I called. The number I had for him was 8 years old, saved in my phone from a time when I'd briefly considered reaching out and then convinced myself not to. It rang 4 times, and I was preparing to leave a voicemail when he answered. Hello? His voice was older. Raspier. But still recognizable, still carrying that hesitant quality I remembered from childhood, like he was always waiting for someone to tell him he'd said the wrong thing. Dad. It's Marcus. Silence. Long enough that I checked to make sure the call was still connected. Marcus, he said my name like he was testing it, making sure it was real. I saw you. At Harrington House. I didn't think you'd noticed. I noticed. More silence. I could hear him breathing, could imagine him standing in whatever cramped apartment he lived in now, trying to figure out what to say to the son he'd sold for $50,000. Why were you there? I asked. You couldn't have been planning to bid. No, I just. He trailed off, and when he spoke again his voice was thick. I wanted to see it one more time. The house. I used to go there when your mother and I were first together, before Harold decided I wasn't good enough. Eleanor, your grandmother, she was kind to me. Used to show me the gardens, tell me stories about the family history. I thought maybe if I saw it again, I'd feel close to her. To that time. I hadn't expected that. Hadn't expected him to mention my mother, to invoke a past that felt so distant it might as well have been fiction. And then you were there, he continued. Sitting in the back like you didn't want anyone to see you. And I thought, what is he doing here? How is he even allowed? And then you, his voice cracked. $8 million. My son. $8 million. I built a company. I know. I looked you up, after. Nexus. I read all the articles. The funding, the acquisition. I read everything. He laughed, a wet sound that was half sob. I didn't even know you'd finished high school. And then I find out you're worth more than all of them combined. I didn't know what to say to that. Part of me wanted to rage at him, to demand answers for questions I'd carried for 2 decades. Why did you sign the papers? Why did you take the money? Why didn't you fight for me? But another part, a part I'd kept locked away for so long I'd forgotten it existed, just wanted to hear his voice a little longer. I want to see you, I said finally. Not to yell at you or demand explanations. Just to see you. Can we do that? Yes. The word came out immediately, desperately. Yes, Marcus. Whenever you want. I'll come to you, I'll meet you anywhere. Just tell me when. We made plans for the following Saturday. A coffee shop in Midtown, neutral territory. I hung up feeling wrung out, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the lawsuit or the property or any of the practical matters consuming my life. Ellen was waiting when I set down the phone. She didn't ask how it went. She just opened her arms, and I went to her, and we stayed like that for a long time. The meeting with my father was awkward in all the ways I'd anticipated and painful in several I hadn't. We sat across from each other at a corner table, 2 cups of coffee growing cold between us, and tried to find a way to talk after 23 years of silence. He looked worse in daylight than he had at the auction. His clothes were clean but worn, the collar of his shirt slightly frayed. His hands shook when he lifted his cup, and I noticed he'd bitten his nails down to the quick. I've been sober for 6 years, he said, noticing my attention. The shakes are from the medication. Anxiety. I take pills now. That's good. The sobriety, I mean. It was the only way I could live with myself. He stared at his coffee. After what I did. I'd promised myself I wouldn't bring it up, wouldn't demand explanations. But the words came out anyway. Why did you sign? The papers, the custody release. Why did you just let them take me? He was quiet for so long I thought he might not answer. Then he looked up, and his eyes were wet. Your mother was gone. I couldn't pay for her funeral. I couldn't pay for the hospital bills. I couldn't pay for the house, the car, any of it. I was drowning, Marcus. And Harold came to me with a lifeboat. A lifeboat that cost you your son. He said it would be better for you. A good school, opportunities, money for college. He said I was dragging you down, that I'd never be able to give you what you deserved. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. And I believed him. I was so broken, so lost, that I believed him. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought you'd be better off. I ran away at 15. I lived in shelters. I washed dishes and stocked shelves for years. I know. His voice was barely a whisper. I know that now. I didn't know then. They didn't tell me. Harold said you were thriving, that you were happy, that you didn't want to see me. And I believed that too, because it was easier than admitting what I'd done. I wanted to hate him. In some ways, it would have been easier if I could. But looking at this broken man across the table, this shell of the father I barely remembered, I couldn't find the rage I'd carried for so long. It had burned away somewhere along the way, leaving only ash and grief. I don't forgive you, I said. I might never be able to forgive you. But I don't want to carry this anymore. The anger, the resentment. It's too heavy. He nodded, tears falling freely now. That's more than I deserve. Probably. I pushed my cold coffee aside. I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Completely honest. Can you do that? Yes. Anything. Do you know why Harrington House matters so much to the family? Not the financial value, not the prestige. The real reason Raymond and Patricia were so desperate to get it? He hesitated. Looked around the coffee shop as if checking for eavesdroppers. Then leaned forward. Your grandfather's will, he said quietly. Harold's will. There was a provision. I only know because I overheard Eleanor talking about it once, years ago. What provision? Whoever holds Harrington House controls the family trust. Not the property trust, the main trust. The one that holds all the Whitfield investments, the business interests, everything. Harold set it up that way because he believed the house represented the soul of the family. Whoever the house belongs to becomes the de facto head of the Whitfields. I sat back in my chair. Suddenly, everything made sense. Raymond's fury, Patricia's barely contained panic, Derek's violent outburst. This wasn't just about real estate or family pride. This was about power. Control. Everything. So when I bought the house, you became the most powerful Whitfield alive. My father smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him. You didn't just beat them at an auction, Marcus. You took their whole kingdom out from under them. Update 2 months later. The lawsuit collapsed on a Tuesday in November. Janet called me with the news while I was supervising the restoration of Harrington House's eastern wing, where water damage had gone unaddressed for years. Raymond's attorneys filed to dismiss. No terms, no settlement demands. They're just dropping it. Any explanation? None officially. But I have a contact at their firm. Apparently Raymond's financial situation took a turn for the worse. He couldn't afford to keep paying legal fees for a case he was going to lose anyway. I thanked her and hung up. Then I walked through the empty halls of my new home, past the rooms that had once hosted generations of Whitfields, and tried to figure out what came next. The trust had been verified. I'd met with Harold's old attorneys, dusty men in dustier offices who'd confirmed what my father told me. As the owner of Harrington House, I now controlled the Whitfield Family Trust, a sprawling entity worth approximately $47 million in diversified investments, real estate holdings, and business interests. I could have done anything with that control. Cut off Raymond's stipend, which I learned he'd been drawing for decades. Revoked Patricia's access to the vacation properties she treated as her personal domains. Frozen Derek out entirely, left him to fend for himself in a world that had never required him to develop any useful skills. Instead, I called a family meeting. They came reluctantly. Raymond had to be convinced by his lawyers that refusing would only make things worse. Patricia arrived with her chin high and her eyes hard, determined to maintain her dignity even in defeat. Derek didn't show up at all. He'd apparently fled to Europe, telling his parents he needed space to process what had happened. Miranda came. That surprised me. She'd always been the quietest of the cousins, the one who seemed to exist in the background of family events without ever drawing attention. We'd barely spoken growing up, and I hadn't thought about her in years. She arrived early, before her parents. Found me in the library, sorting through decades of accumulated papers that the previous administrators had let pile up. I wanted to thank you, she said from the doorway. I looked up. For what? For showing them they're not invincible. She stepped into the room, her posture uncertain but her voice steady. My whole life, I've watched my parents and Derek act like they were entitled to everything, like the world owed them something just for existing. And nobody ever challenged them. Nobody ever said no. She smiled slightly. Until you. I'm not sure revenge is worth thanking me for. Is that what this is? Revenge? I considered the question. Set down the papers I've been sorting. Honestly? I don't know anymore. It started that way. When I found out about the auction, when I realized I had enough money to actually compete, all I could think about was the look on Derek's face when he realized he'd lost. The look on Patricia's face. The moment when they'd understand that the broke boy they'd mocked and dismissed had beaten them. And now? Now I own a house that needs more repairs than I can count, control a trust I'm not sure I want, and have a family that hates me even more than they did before. I shrugged. I'm not sure what the victory is supposed to feel like. Miranda was quiet for a moment. Then she crossed the room and sat in the leather chair across from my desk. I'm in law school, she said. 3rd year. Estate planning, ironically. I know I've never been close to you, Marcus, and I know my family has treated you terribly. But I don't want to be like them. I never have. What are you asking? I'm asking if there's room for me. In whatever you're building here. I'm asking if this family can be something different than what it's been. I studied her face, looking for the calculation I'd learned to expect from Whitfields. I didn't find it. What I found instead was something that looked like hope. The meeting's in an hour, I said finally. Let's see how it goes. Raymond and Patricia arrived together, dressed formally as if this were a board meeting rather than a conversation in a living room. They sat on the antique sofa across from my chair and waited with the rigid patience of people who expected to be lectured. I didn't lecture them. Instead, I laid out the facts. The trust was worth $47 million. It had been generating approximately $3 million per year in returns, most of which had been distributed as stipends to family members or reinvested according to Harold's original directives. As the new controller, I had the authority to change those directives. I could redirect funds, cut off distributions, liquidate assets. But I'm not going to do that, I said. At least, not the way you're probably expecting. Raymond's eyes narrowed. What do you mean? I mean I'm not interested in punishing you. I'm not interested in revenge or settling scores or proving anything about who deserves what. I leaned forward. I'm interested in making this family functional. And that starts with transparency. Over the next hour, I outlined my proposal. The trust would continue to operate, but with new oversight mechanisms. An independent board would review all distributions, ensuring they went to legitimate purposes rather than subsidizing lavish lifestyles. Family members who wanted access to trust funds would need to demonstrate either financial need or productive investment plans. The stipends Raymond and Patricia had been drawing would be reduced but not eliminated, enough to maintain their homes and basic expenses, not enough to fund private jets and designer wardrobes. This is outrageous, Patricia said when I finished. You can't simply rewrite the rules because you happen to hold a piece of paper. I can, actually. That's exactly what the trust documents authorize. I kept my voice neutral. But I'm choosing not to do it unilaterally. That's why I'm telling you this now, in person, instead of just implementing changes through lawyers. And if we refuse to accept these conditions? Then nothing changes legally. The trust operates according to my decisions whether you accept them or not. But I'd rather have your cooperation than your opposition. This is supposed to help the family, not tear it apart further. Raymond had been silent since my presentation began. Now he spoke, his voice tired. Why? Why not just take everything and be done with it? You clearly hate us. You have every reason to want us to suffer. I don't hate you. The words surprised me even as I said them. I'm angry at you. I think you've behaved badly for most of your lives. But hate? I shook my head. That takes too much energy. And I'd rather spend that energy building something than tearing something down. The silence stretched. Patricia looked at her husband. Raymond looked at his hands. Miranda, sitting quietly in the corner where she'd remained throughout the meeting, caught my eye and nodded almost imperceptibly. We need time to think, Raymond said finally. Take all the time you need. The new policies go into effect January 1st regardless, but I'd prefer to implement them with your input rather than over your objections. They left without saying goodbye. I hadn't expected them to. But as I watched their car pull down the driveway, I felt something I hadn't anticipated. Relief. Not satisfaction, not triumph. Just relief that it was done, that I'd said what I needed to say, that whatever came next would be their choice to make. The holidays came and went. I spent Christmas at Harrington House with Ellen, the two of us wandering through rooms that still smelled of fresh paint and sawdust, imagining what the place might become once the renovations were complete. The house revealed itself to us slowly over those weeks. Hidden doors that led to servants' passages, long since sealed and forgotten. A wine cellar with bottles dating back to Prohibition, some still drinkable according to the appraiser I hired. A small chapel on the third floor, its stained glass windows depicting scenes from what appeared to be a private mythology, figures I didn't recognize engaged in ceremonies whose meaning had been lost to time. Eleanor, my grandmother, had left journals. I found them in a cedar chest in the master bedroom, wrapped in tissue paper and tied with faded ribbon. She documented everything, the family gatherings, the business dealings, the quiet moments between the public performances. Reading her words, I learned things about the Whitfields that no living member had ever mentioned. She loved my mother. That was the first surprise. The journals from the late 1980s were filled with entries about Catherine, how bright she was, how kind, how different from Patricia with her calculations and Raymond with his ambitions. Eleanor had hoped Catherine would be the one to carry the family forward, to bring something human to the cold machinery of wealth and status. She married a man without money, Eleanor wrote in 1994, but with something far more valuable, genuine feeling. Thomas looks at her the way Henry looked at me, before the family's expectations wore us down. I pray they hold on to that. I pray they protect it from Harold and his ledgers. They hadn't protected it, of course. Or couldn't. The weight of expectation, the pressure of judgment, the slow erosion of poverty against love, it had all taken its toll. But reading those words, I understood something new about my parents' marriage. It hadn't been a mistake, no matter what the rest of the family believed. It had been real. I showed the journals to Ellen on Christmas Eve, sitting by the fire in the great room while snow fell outside the windows. She read in silence for a long time, turning pages with careful fingers. She knew, Ellen said finally. Your grandmother. She saw what Harold was doing to the family, and she documented it. Almost like she was leaving evidence. Evidence of what? Of who they really were. Who they could have been. Ellen set down the journal she'd been reading. Marcus, these aren't just memories. They're testimony. Your grandmother was building a case. A case against her own family? A case for changing it. Look at this entry. She picked up another journal, flipped to a marked page. She writes about the trust, about Harold's provisions. She says she tried to convince him to include protections, ways for future generations to reform the structure if it became corrupt. He refused. I took the journal from her. Read the passage she'd indicated, then the ones that followed. Eleanor Whitfield, it seemed, had spent the last years of her life trying to plant seeds of change in soil that refused to accept them. Harold believes money is protection, she'd written. But protection from what? From life? From growth? From the consequences of our own choices? I watch our grandchildren and I see them becoming small, their horizons shrinking to fit the boundaries of their trust funds. Only Catherine's boy seems different. He has her eyes, her curiosity. I hope he escapes before the walls close and completely. I'd been 11 when she wrote that. A year before my mother's diagnosis. 2 years before everything fell apart. She wanted you to have this house, Ellen said. She wanted you to find these journals. That's why she left them here instead of with the lawyers or the family. You can't know that. No. But it makes sense, doesn't it? She knew the house would be sold eventually. Knew that whoever bought it would find what she left behind. She was gambling that the right person would find it. The right person. I wasn't sure I qualified. But sitting there with my grandmother's words in my hands, I felt something I hadn't expected. Connection. To a woman I'd barely known, to a history that was more complicated than I'd understood, to a family that had always seemed like nothing but adversaries. A retreat center, Ellen suggested the next morning, standing in the ballroom where generations of Whitfields had celebrated their privilege. For tech workers recovering from burnout. Or a scholarship program for kids from backgrounds like yours. Maybe both. Maybe both. She wrapped her arms around me from behind. You've done an incredible thing, you know. Most people would have used that money to buy a yacht and disappear. Yachts are terrible investments. She laughed. That's not why you didn't buy one. No. It wasn't. My father came for New Year's Eve. It was awkward at first, we still didn't know how to be around each other, still had years of absence stretching between us like a canyon. But Ellen helped bridge the gap, drawing him into conversations about her work, about the house, about the future we were trying to build. At midnight, standing on the terrace overlooking grounds that had once seemed like the pinnacle of everything I could never have, I found myself next to him. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I know I've said it before, but I need to keep saying it. For the rest of my life, probably. I'm sorry for what I did to you. I know you are. Does it help? Knowing? I thought about the question. About the years I'd spent angry, the years I'd spent pretending I didn't care, the years I'd spent building something just to prove I could. It helps, I said finally. It doesn't fix anything. It doesn't erase what happened. But it helps. He nodded. We stood there in silence as fireworks exploded somewhere in the distance, painting the sky with colors that faded as quickly as they appeared. By February, something unexpected had happened. Miranda had become my de facto liaison with the rest of the family, keeping me informed of Raymond and Patricia's gradual acceptance of the new trust structure. Derek had returned from Europe, chastened and apparently willing to consider finding actual employment. Even Patricia had begun sending occasional emails, terse and formal, but civil in a way that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. More surprising still, my father had started volunteering at a community center in Brooklyn, helping teach financial literacy to teenagers from low-income families. He'd approached me about starting a scholarship fund using trust resources. I'd approved it immediately. You're changing them, Ellen observed one evening, watching me review applications for the first round of scholarships. I'm giving them the option to change. That's different. Is it? I set down the application I'd been reading. When I was 15, I made a choice. I decided that I'd rather struggle on my own than accept help from people who'd humiliated me. And that choice shaped everything that came after, the jobs, the education, the company, all of it. But it was still a choice. They have the same choice now. They can accept the new reality and find a way to be useful, or they can keep fighting and lose everything. And if they choose to fight? Then they fight. I shrugged. But I don't think they will. Patricia's already talking to Miranda about starting a foundation for arts education. Raymond's accountant tells me he's actually looking at his expenses for the first time in decades. Even Derek, apparently he's enrolled in a coding boot camp. Says he wants to understand what I built. Ellen smiled. So the revenge worked. This isn't revenge anymore. If it ever really was. She came around behind me, resting her hands on my shoulders. Then what is it? I thought about the auction, About Derek's fist connecting with my jaw, about my father's voice on the phone after all those years of silence. I thought about Harrington House and the generations of history it held, the privilege and pain woven through its walls like threads in a tapestry. It's a start, I said. That's all. Just a start. The last piece fell into place on a Saturday in March. I'd driven to Connecticut for a meeting with the contractors handling the carriage house renovation, and on my way back to the car, I found someone waiting for me. Derek. He looked different than he had at the auction. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something more uncertain. He stood with his hands in his jacket pockets, shoulders hunched against the late winter cold. I came to apologize, he said without preamble. For hitting you. And for everything else. The way I treated you growing up. The things I said. I waited. I've been doing a lot of thinking since November. About who I've been. Who I want to be, he laughed, a short, humorless sound. Turns out losing everything is great for perspective. You didn't lose everything. The trust is still providing for you. I know. That's part of what I'm apologizing for. He met my eyes. You could have destroyed us. All of us. And instead you gave us a chance. I don't understand why, but I'm grateful for it. This was the moment I'd imagined countless times in the months since the auction. Derek, humbled. Derek, apologizing. Derek, finally recognizing that I was his equal, or more. In my imagination, this moment had always felt triumphant, validating, the culmination of everything I'd worked for. In reality, it just felt sad. We're family, I said. That has to mean something. Even when it's been twisted and damaged and almost destroyed. It has to mean something. Derek nodded slowly. Does this mean we're okay? It means we're not enemies anymore. The rest, I shook my head. The rest takes time. Years, probably. But we can start. I extended my hand. Derek looked at it for a moment, something complicated passing across his face. Then he took it, and we shook, two cousins who'd spent their lives on opposite sides of an invisible war, finally finding a way to stop fighting. I drove back to Brooklyn as the sun set behind me, painting the highway in shades of orange and gold. Alan was waiting at our apartment, takeout containers already spread across the coffee table, some documentary queued up on the television. How was Connecticut? Surprising. I sat down beside her, stealing a spring roll from the nearest container. Derek apologized. Her eyebrows rose. Sincerely? I think so. As sincere as Derek's capable of being, anyway. That's good? Is that good? I considered the question while I chewed. The spring roll was excellent, crispy outside, perfectly seasoned inside. Alan had found a new Thai place while I was gone. Yeah, I said finally. I think it's good. Not fixed, not healed, but good. Like the first step in a very long walk. She leaned her head against my shoulder. On the television, David Attenborough was narrating something about penguins, his voice calm and reassuring against the backdrop of Antarctic ice. So what happens now? She asked. Now I finish restoring the house. Launch the scholarship fund. Figure out how to run a family trust without becoming the kind of person who needs to run a family trust. I wrapped my arm around her. And maybe start thinking about the future. Our future. Beyond revenge and family drama and all the rest of it. You mean like, normal life stuff? Mortgages and vacations and eventually, maybe, tiny humans running around demanding attention? Something like that. She tilted her head to look at me. I'd like that. Me too. We sat there as the documentary played on, penguins waddling across frozen landscapes, navigating obstacles with determined grace. I thought about all the obstacles I'd navigated to reach this point, the poverty, the abandonment, the years of struggle. I thought about the family I'd been born into and the family I was building now. I thought about my father, slowly finding his way back to being a person I could respect, and my cousins, slowly learning that wealth wasn't the same as worth. Most of all, I thought about the auction. The moment I'd raised my paddle and changed everything. It had felt like victory then, like the culmination of a war I'd been fighting my whole life. But now, looking back, I understood it differently. It wasn't victory. It wasn't revenge. It was just the moment when I finally stopped letting them define me. The moment when I stopped being the broke boy in the back row and became something else entirely. Something I chose for myself. The penguins on television were diving into freezing water, hunting for fish to feed their chicks. Attenborough was explaining how they worked together, how survival in such a harsh environment required cooperation and sacrifice and trust. Family, I thought. Even penguins understood it. Even in the coldest places on Earth, family meant something. I pulled Ellen closer and watched the penguins swim. Some people spend their whole lives trying to prove they belong, chasing acceptance from those who will never give it, measuring themselves against standards they didn't choose. But the truth I learned, standing in that auction house with a paddle in my hand, is that belonging isn't something anyone else can give you or take away. It comes from knowing who you are, what you've built, and what you're willing to fight for. The best revenge isn't destruction, it's becoming someone you're proud of, someone who can offer grace to those who never showed you any. That's not weakness. That's the kind of strength that actually lasts.